not, I am Dr. Don Schwartz, also known as the History Don. And this is lecture one of a four-part lecture series on the Constitution and what the framers got right about the Constitution and what they got wrong. I'll be speaking for about 50 minutes or so in order to leave time for questions or comments. And so let us begin. The United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is also the oldest, longest lasting constitution in the history of the world. And the Constitution is in the news every day. We are told that we are currently in the middle of a constitutional crisis over the transition of power, at least until January 20th. But the Constitution is like the Bible and like the works of William Shakespeare. In what way, you may ask? Well, everybody knows about the Constitution, everybody speaks well about it, but very few people have ever read it. And in this presidential election year, many of us may be scratching our heads about some facets of the Constitution, such as the Electoral College. How is it possible that a candidate who can win the popular vote cannot get elected president? That has happened twice in this century. Al Gore got more votes than George W. Bush in 2000, and Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump in 2016. Another thing that seems mystifying about the Constitution, how is it that the two Dakotas, North and South Dakota, have twice as many senators as California? Whereas the population of California is 23 times as large as the combined populations of North and South Dakota. And why is it that slaves in the Constitution were counted as just 3/5 of a human being? Now, the fact that we are still governed by an 18th century construct is really something of a miracle. The founders designed a government that was really intended for a small agrarian society in 1789, a country that had just 4 million people. And out of that 4 million, 700,000 were slaves. It was a society in which 95% of the people were farmers. And so the United States has changed dramatically since the end of the 18th century. We've become a highly industrialized technological society. Our population today is 82 times as large as it was in 1789. And the majority of Americans live in cities. And we are a far more diverse nation than when the Constitution was written. Yet, while society has greatly transformed over the past 2 centuries, the basic structure of our government has not changed. And so these 4 lectures will attempt to explain why the Constitution was constructed the way it was. And I hope that you'll be able to determine the extent to which the Constitution continues to serve the needs of the American people in the 21st century and the extent to which it no longer serves our needs. But in order to comprehend the Constitution, we must look at the historical context, that is, the conditions from which the Constitution arose. We have to understand the circumstances that led the founding fathers to abandon the existing form of government in 1787 and adopt an entirely different construct. We have to understand the debates that arose during the Constitutional Convention, and we must tried to comprehend why the framers decided on what should be included in the Constitution and what should be left out. Now, you might have heard of the controversy surrounding the phrase original intent. There is a struggle between those who believe in original intent versus those who believe in what is called a living constitution. Original intent refers to the inclination of some conservative judges to interpret the meaning of a particular provision in the Constitution by determining what the framers intended the provision to mean in 1787. More liberal justices claim that it's impossible to know what was in the minds of the framers some 233 years ago. And therefore, we should interpret the Constitution today in a broader, more flexible way. That is, that the Constitution should not be seen as something etched in stone, but rather it should provide some flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances, and therefore it should be seen as a living and breathing document. Now, let's go back in the history of colonial America. By 1776, colonists had had their fill with monarchical government because of the abuses they suffered under the rule of King George III. And so following independence, Americans took it for granted that the best type of government was not a monarchy, but rather a republic. A republic, as we see in this definition, is a state where sovereignty rests with the people or their representatives, rather than with a monarch. That is, a republic is a country with no monarchy. Now, the founders were convinced that the American Revolution should be fought to get rid of monarchical rule and replace it with a republic. In a republic, leaders are elected as opposed to hereditary rulers or an entrenched aristocracy that gets rights and privileges from birth. In a republic, power resides in the people. This is what is called popular sovereignty. In a monarchy, power rests solely with the monarch. Now, while these seem like common sense ideas today, in the 18th century, this type of a government was really considered revolutionary. So in the end of the 18th century, most people throughout the world were under the rule of hereditary monarchs. And so when the founders conceived of a republic, that was really considered radical at the end of the 18th century. Now, we know that, of course, the Revolutionary War was successful. We won our independence. But even after independence, what emerged could hardly be called a nation. Even in 1776, the Declaration of Independence did not create a nation. The very word nation was explicitly dropped from the Declaration of Independence. And all references to government in the Declaration of Independence were to the separate 13 states. The heading of the final version read, "The Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America." And the Declaration of Independence stated, "We therefore solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states." So, in other words, independence did not mean an independent nation. It meant free and independent states. And it goes on to say that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other things, acts and things which independent states may of right do. So we might have assumed that the United States, as we know it today, was born after the American Revolution, but that is not the case. In fact, there were many factors that worked against the union of 13 states. So what were these factors working against unity? And here we see a map of the 13 states after 1776. Well, before the revolution, the 13 colonies had no history of enduring cooperation with each other. Another factor working against unity is that following the revolution, the people were more loyal to their respective states than to this newly independent nation. Not only that, but these states occupied a large land area and they lacked close contact with each other because roads were in very poor conditions. There were very few bridges. And so transportation was really inadequate. And so people did not have the opportunity to travel to other states. And the states were not interdependent economically. And so, for example, some states traded more with the West Indies and with Europe than with other states. And after the revolution, the 13 states no longer faced a common enemy. In addition, because they suffered so much under British tyranny, most Americans shared a deep mistrust of a powerful central government. They felt that their liberties could best be protected if power was dispelled among the 13 states rather than concentrated in a central government. And so the dominant legacy of the American Revolution was obsessive suspicion against a powerful central government, a government that would operate far away. Let's say if the government was centered in Washington, that's very far from Georgia or South Carolina or Maine. And so there was this mistrust. And there was a sense that it would be best to empower states rather than a federal government. And so it's not surprising that the first form of government that arose after independence called for a very weak central government. It was known as the Articles of Confederation. A confederation is a government that encompasses several states, where the component states still retain considerable independence. The members of a confederation often delegate only a few powers to the central authority. A good example of a confederation today would be the European Union. The European Union is made up of 27 independent nations, which delegate some power to a central authority. But for all intents and purposes, those 27 nations are independent of each other. And so that was the system that was set up after the revolution. And there was a central government, but it was very weak. And so under the Articles of Confederation, in order to pass a law for the entire 13 states, 9 of the 13 states had to approve in order to pass a law. Now, we know how difficult it's become to pass a law today. Could you imagine how difficult it must have been if you needed 9 out of 13 states to approve a law? Not only that, but under the Articles of Confederation, there was no president. There was no chief executive to enforce whatever laws were passed. Under the Articles of Confederation, there were no courts to interpret the laws. And although there was a Congress, that Congress did not have the power to tax or to raise an army. Every one of the states had their own currency. So it was almost impossible to do business from one state to another because they had different currencies. In addition, if the country were to be attacked, Congress could only request that the states raise troops to defend the country. They could not mandate or order an army to be formed. Congress did not have any power to regulate commerce. And so states could set up tariffs against products coming in from other states. And so you can see that it was very difficult to operate a unified country when so much power had been devolved to the states rather than to the central government. And so this cartoon shows the country under the Articles of Confederation as a ship that is being buffeted by some of the problems. And the waves are labeled no power to collect taxes, no power to raise an army, no power to enforce laws, no national court system, no power to enforce treaties. And the caption reads, rough sailing ahead. In addition to all of this, these 13 states were as dramatically different from each other as they were from England. And each jealously guarded its self-rule, its independence, and its sovereignty. Each raised its own army, chartered its own navy, oversaw its own Indian affairs, and had its own postal service. Each state had its own legislature, its own functioning courts, its own taxes, its own system of weights and measures even. And so the years under the Articles of Confederation, 1783 to 1787, has been called the critical period in American history, and for very good reason. As you can see in this cartoon, the states clashed with each other.
It looks like Don is frozen for some reason.
When states were actually competing with each other, states with viable ports tax goods coming in from nearby states, and those states then retaliated in any way they could. And so this cartoon shows the United States under the Articles of Confederation heading for a disaster, and yet the 13 states are not rowing together. Not only that, but other countries were taking advantage of America's weakness. And so the British occupied forts in this yellow area west of the 13 colonies. Spain closed off the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. And in the Mediterranean, Barbary pirates were seizing American ships and enslaving the crews. And there was nothing that the government could do about it. In addition to all of this, the treasury was empty by 1789. and debts to foreign governments and to our own citizen were going unpaid. To make matters worse, farmers in Western Massachusetts were losing their farms to creditors, and so they rose up in rebellion, led by Daniel Shays. It became known as Shays' Rebellion, and it sent shockwaves across the 13 states. With no national police force, people feared further disorder. They feared that this rebellion would spread. So it was out of this sense of crisis and doom that many people became convinced that the Articles of Confederation were no longer working as an effective government, and therefore it should be revised. And so a constitutional convention was called to meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 in order to revise the existing form of government. So let's take a look at the delegates to this constitutional convention. A dozen men emerged as the critical participants, and you see their names here. Now, James Madison was the most important of the framers of the Constitution. He played a crucial role at each of the major points of the process. He helped to call the convention. He helped to frame the Constitution. He was instrumental in the ratification process and also in deciding whether to add a Bill of Rights. And it was also, he took notes during the Constitutional Convention, and that is how we know what took place. Now, while these were the most important participants of the Constitutional Convention, the convention was equally notable for who was not there. And so, for example, Thomas Jefferson was off in Europe during the Constitutional Convention, as were Thomas Paine and John Adams. John Jay was banned by the New York delegation because they felt that he was too openly nationalistic, that he was too much in favor of a strong central government. John Hancock was too busy at the governor's mansion in Massachusetts, so he did not attend. Patrick Henry refused to attend because he said, quote, he smelled a rat. What he meant was that he thought that the delegates were going to overthrow the Articles of Confederation and set up a too powerful central government. Samuel Adams did not attend. He remained in Massachusetts, much to the relief of those who wanted a stronger central government, because Samuel Adams was very much opposed to a strong central government. So let's take a look at what the 55 delegates who did attend, what they had in common. Well, all of them were men of wealth and comfort. They were from the social elite. They were landowners, they were slaveholders, lawyers, merchants, security speculators. There was not one of the 55 who was from ordinary means. There was not one farmer, not a shopkeeper, not a worker, or a seaman among the 55. They were all, the 55 also had a near monopoly on formal and professional education. Most of the 55 were lawyers or men who had studied law, and they shared common attitudes. Very few of them questioned the class, gender, or racial bias of their privileged status. They were all white males, and they were all concerned about their reputations and their political futures. They were responsible for answering to their respective state legislatures who appointed them to go to Philadelphia. Therefore, they insisted on absolute secrecy during the proceedings because none of the 55 wanted to go on record for supporting measures that their own state legislatures might have opposed. So that is why the proceedings were kept in secret. And also, because it was secret, they could be honest in their discussions and not worry that it would get back to the state legislature. Another thing that they all had in common is that they all sensed that the nation was in peril and that something had to be done to create a stronger central government. Those leaders who opposed a stronger central government stayed home. Already mentioned Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Paine. Finally, another thing that the delegates shared in common was that none of them knew how the convention would turn out. In fact, most did not think that anything could really be accomplished. Now let's take a look at what they did not have in common. Some were honorable and self-sacrificing, while others were vain, ambitious, and unscrupulous. Some came from small states, others came from large states. And so, for example, Roger Sherman came from the small state of Connecticut, and he opposed James Madison, who came from the large state of Virginia, over how representation should be determined in Congress. Another major issue that divided the delegates was over slavery. George Mason of Virginia considered slavery a blight on Republican values, whereas most other Southern delegates defended the institution of slavery. And many delegates were disturbed by the failure to include a Bill of Rights when the Constitution was originally drawn up. So these are things that divided the delegates. Now let's take a look at the proceedings themselves. Remember, the convention was called not to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, but rather to revise them. However, in the end, the Articles of Confederation were eliminated. In fact, almost at the beginning, when the convention met, there was an agreement that there should be 3 branches of government, that power should be divided between a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. The governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, made this proposal on May 30th, 1787, soon after the convention began. And that is the system that we have today, where power is divided. The legislature is empowered to enact laws, the executive is empowered to enforce the law, and the judiciary is empowered to interpret the law. This proposal was immediately accepted by the delegates. And by accepting the 3 branches of government, the delegates had crossed the Rubicon, meaning they had made a commitment to create a new government. Now, while the delegates differed on many different things, they all agreed that the Articles of Confederation had to be replaced with a form of government that had a stronger central government. It was extraordinarily hot in the summer of 1787, but the windows were kept shut at the convention in order to keep insects out. The blinds were drawn in order to protect against prying eyes. And the delegates wilted in their woolen clothing at the time. So you can imagine how difficult it must have been for them in the very hot summer of 1787 with the windows closed and the blinds drawn. And there were a number of unseemly features about the convention. First of all, it wasn't even legal, since the convention was called to revise the Articles of Confederation, not to replace them entirely. And that is exactly what the delegates did. The fact that the sessions were conducted in utter secrecy, that doesn't sound like a formula for democratic government. And that the 55 delegates were wealthy white males, hardly representative of the population as a whole. And Southern delegates used this proceedings to obtain assurances that slavery would not be abolished. They made it very clear that if this new Constitution were to abolish slavery, then the Southern states would walk out and they would not join this new nation. Before the convention began, many doubted that representatives from the 13 states could agree on anything. Among the doubters was the president of the convention, George Washington. The delegates assumed that humans were very corruptible and that power always corrupted. The British philosopher Lord Acton said, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." So here is the conundrum. The delegates recognized that it was important to give more power to a central government. Yet they also assumed that power corrupts people who are empowered. And so the delegates doubted that any of their achievements in Philadelphia could stand the test of time. The convention was set to open on May 14th, but because of travel difficulties, it was not until late May that the quorum of 7 states could be met. Alexander Hamilton was one of 3 delegates from the state of New York. Hamilton was a strong advocate of a powerful central government. This was before he became a Broadway star, by the way. But the other 2 members of the New York delegation opposed a strong central government. As far as they were concerned, Hamilton thought too continentally instead of thinking of state power. Rhode Island was the only one of the 13 states that decided to boycott the proceedings entirely, because the state of Rhode Island felt that it was so small that whatever agreements would be arranged at the convention, it would be at the expense of the smaller states. Now, the delegates had to confront the following questions. What exactly do we want government to do for us? Is the purpose of government to simply defend against foreign attack and do nothing for the American people? Or should government be responsible for the economic well-being of American citizens? Should it regulate the economy, for example? Another question they had to resolve is how much power should be given to the central government, how much power should be retained by state governments. And how could this new government protect the rights of individuals? So these were all questions that had to be addressed during the convention. Now, there were a number of obstacles to compromise. Any power granted to the central government meant diminished autonomy of the states. Small states, such as Delaware, clung to their sovereignty. They were afraid that a strong national government would be dominated by the larger, wealthier states. Rhode Island felt that way as well. And with Rhode Island boycotting the proceedings and the delegates from New York who were determined to sabotage the convention, there was really very little hope for unanimity. And many doubted that a Republican form of government could be preserved over a land that was so vast, with a variety of people that had so many different interests. Now, throughout history, the only successful republics were in very small geographic areas, such as the ancient Greek city-states or Swiss cantons. There had never been a Republican form of government over such a large territory as represented by the 13 states. And most significant obstacle to compromise was the dispute over slavery, which threatened to tear the convention apart. Well, the first debate that emerged at the Constitutional Convention was over the executive branch. Most delegates agreed that the greatest power should reside not in the executive branch, but in the legislature. That is, the legislature should have the power to enact laws and raise taxes, whereas the executive branch should simply administer laws passed by Congress. No one anticipated that the executive branch would ultimately dominate the new government. They conceived of the president as having a supporting role, sort of like an errand boy for Congress, rather than a powerful leader who would set policy for the new nation. And whoever served as president would of necessity be a stranger to most of the country, because there was not the transportation and communication that we have today. People were only familiar with those in their own region. And so it was very difficult for someone to acquire a national reputation. In fact, in 1787, there were only two people who had a national reputation. One was George Washington, because of his role as commander during the American Revolution, and the other was Benjamin Franklin, because of his famous inventions. And so there was fear that whoever would serve as president would bring a regional perspective rather than a national perspective, that he would have regional biases. There was also a debate as to how the chief executive should be chosen. So, for example, there were some who said, let Congress choose the president. But others said, if you allow Congress to choose the president, then that would give too much power to Congress. And that would mean that Congress would control not only the legislative branch, but also the executive branch, because Congress would decide who would be the chief executive. Then there was a suggestion that state legislatures should choose the president. But that would give too much power to the states. And then somebody came up with a really radical idea in the 18th century. Let the people decide who should be the president. Well, as one delegate said, that would be like letting a blind man make a choice of color. And what he meant was that in the 18th century, people were largely uneducated, and they were unfamiliar with anything outside their own local vicinity. And given the deficiencies of 18th century communication and transportation, it was very difficult for people to understand what was going on in other parts of the nation. And so ultimately, the decision over how the president should be chosen was made through the conception of an electoral college system. Now, that electoral college system that was decided upon by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention is still with us today. And this cartoon shows it as this insane maze as a path to the White House. The decision was that each state legislature should choose electors who would ultimately make the choice as to who would be the president of the United States. Now, most state legislatures ordered electors to vote for the candidate that got the most votes. But there were some states that did not mandate that. And so this is the system that we are stuck with today. The Electoral College is certainly not a democratic institution, but it was never intended to be democratic. The reason the framers decided on an electoral college system was that they felt that these electors would be much better educated than ordinary Americans, and therefore they would make wiser choices rather than to leave the choice of electing the president up to ordinary people. So in effect, the electoral college system was designed specifically to thwart the will of the majority. And then there was the debate over the legislature. Should Congress represent the states, or should they represent the people of the republic? Now, those favoring a strong central government were called nationalists, men like Madison and Hamilton. And they believed that Congress should represent the interests of the people rather than the interests of the states. But there were those who were suspicious of a powerful central government, and they wanted Congress to represent the states and not the people. And so large states like Virginia wanted representation in Congress to be based on the population of the states, while smaller states such as New Jersey wanted equal representation in Congress. So how do we resolve this? The largest states say they want more representation because they have more people. Smaller states said that all 13 states should have the same representation. Well, the answer to this problem was found through compromise. Connecticut came up with the compromise of having a two-house legislature, one that would satisfy the small states. It would be called the Senate, and every state in the Senate would be represented by 2 senators. And there would be a House of Representatives that would meet the demands of the larger, more populous states. And so in the House of Representatives, the more populous states would have more representatives. This was known as the Connecticut Compromise. It was also called the Great Compromise. Another debate emerged over slavery. Some delegates spoke out against slavery, but Southern delegates made it very clear that they would leave the convention if slavery were prohibited. Also, Southern states wanted slaves to be counted for the purpose of representation in Congress. And so, for example, South Carolina, more than half of the population of South Carolina was made up of slaves. So when it came time to find out how many representatives South Carolina should have in the House of Representatives, South Carolina said, well, you have to count slaves as part of our population. But Southern states also said that slaves should not be counted in determining the taxes that should be paid to the federal government. So the Southern states wanted it both ways. They wanted slaves to be counted for the purpose of representation in Congress, but they should not be counted for the purpose of taxation. And so, once again, a compromise was arrived at. And Southerners also wanted to continue the slave trade even after the Constitution was finalized. The compromise was called the 3/5 Compromise. For every 5 slaves, they would be counted as 3 people for the purposes of both taxation and representation. Every 5 slaves would be the equivalent of 3 people. And as part of the compromise, the slave trade would continue, but only for 20 years, and that it would be suspended after 1808. Now, the impact of the 3/5 Compromise was dramatic. It gave the slave states 25 additional seats in the House of Representatives by counting every 5 slaves as 3 individuals. And because Southern states had 25 additional seats in the House of Representatives, that gave the Southern states 25 additional electoral votes, because each state's electoral votes is the equivalent of their representation in the House and in the Senate. So you can see that the 3/5 Compromise benefited Southern states in Congress. And that gave slave owners disproportionate influence, not only in Congress, but also in the executive branch, because it gave more electoral votes to Southern states. And because it gave Southern states influence over who would be president, and presidents appoint justices to the Supreme Court, the 3/5 Compromise also gave the slaveholding states influence over the third branch of government, the Supreme Court. Now, slavery, the word slavery was never mentioned in the Constitution. You could read the Constitution forward and back, and you will not see the word slavery. Instead, the Constitution uses euphemisms in referring to slaves. In Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, they talk about slaves as other persons. In Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, it says, such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. So they're talking about such persons, meaning the other persons previously mentioned. And then in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, they talk about a person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof. In each of these articles, they're referring to slaves. But because of the controversy over slavery, the Constitution tried to avoid this issue of slavery entirely, even to the extent of not even mentioning the word. So toleration for slavery was the price for getting all states to accept the Constitution. But in doing this, the Constitution only forestalled the question over slavery, and that question would not be decided until the Civil War. So I'll finish this first lecture by pointing out that the delegates signed the Constitution on September 17th, 1787. And since then, every year, September 17th is designated as Constitution Day. So at this point, I'm going to hold up, and we will take a look at, have you